title given is Honour and Action. Presumably the two can go together. And that's one of the things we shall perhaps discover in the course of the next hour and a half or so. We're going to start with Andy King, who's known, I fancy, to most of you in this room. I would think he's been around at these conferences since I can't remember when.
Quite a while. Yeah.
Contributing his piece, and he's going to do this trick again, as it were, today, talking about...
Slight change of title.
That's right, the slight change of title, right. Okay, well, I leave you to talk to the revised title. Okay.
Thank you very much. Whoever should be involved in such clashes as the French and the Portuguese were at El Gibraltar must bear the risks if they do not wish to flee. It would seem that pride carries more danger than the heat of battle, for in fleeing you may be chased, caught and killed. In battle, when you see yourself bested, you give yourself up and are then kept prisoner, because whoever is in prison is not dead. So wrote Jean Froissart, perhaps the foremost 14th century chronicler of the mores of war and chivalry. The capture of prisoners has been seen as a vital part of large-scale battles in the late Middle Ages, typified by the scrum at the close of the Battle of Poitiers, 1356, where, according to Chandos Herald's Life of the Black Prince, quote, you could see many an archer, many a knight, many a squire running on all sides to take prisoners. But was the taking prisoners in large-scale battles quite such commonplace as Froissart implies? And as historians have often since assumed, was it actually safer to stay on the battlefield and surrender than to flee? In the first place, as has often been noted, the increasing effectiveness of foot soldiers had made the battlefield a much more deadly environment for men-at-arms. Thus, the French famously suffered huge losses against Flemish militia armed with pole arms at Courtrai in 1302, and the English came to grief against Scots footmen armed with long spears at Bannockburn in 1314, a battle which was incidentally explicitly compared with Courtrai by the Scholar Chronicler, written by Sir Thomas Gray, whose father had fought at Bannockburn. In particular, of course, the employment by the English of large numbers of archers greatly increased the risks of battle for their opponents. Archery, by its very nature, was indiscriminate in lethality, and surrender to a body of archers who might be 100 yards or more away was simply not a practical possibility. There also remained the real danger of being crushed to death by the oppressive people. The worst case of this was at Gyplin Moor in 1332 in Scotland, where thousands of Scots suffocated when two divisions of their army tried to charge down the same constricted valley at the same time. But similar crushes developed at other battles. For instance, the English chronicler Geoffrey of Baker's account of Cressy, 1346, describes how, quote, in the middle of the French army, many were crushed to death without any wound, smothered by the weight of the crowd. And the author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, something I've heard, Gesta Henrici, any idea which is the correct, who by his own account was present at the Battle of Agincourt, referred to those, quote, lying crushed in between the heaps of the slain. And these factors conspire to ensure that in full-scale battle, even those of the armigerous classes and the nobility might be killed before they had any opportunity to try to surrender. However, even those who did manage to survive the dangers of the battlefield long enough to try to surrender might not have their surrender accepted, irrespective of rank. At Cressy, in 1346, Philip VI of France took the decision before the battle that no prisoners were to be taken, and he raised the Oriflamme banner to signal that this was to be a guerre mortelle, or mortal battle, a war to the death. Or at least, this was how the event was interpreted by the English. The contemporary English chronicler, Geoffrey Le Baker, has an intriguing explanation of this decision. And according to his account, the heroes of the French were so confident in the multitude of Philip VI's army that particular individuals requested particular Englishmen to be assigned to their prisons. But the shrewd tyrant, fearing that they would be excessively preoccupied with the capture of nobles, and so would fight for the common victory only half-heartedly, ordered his standard, called the Oriflamme, to be unfurled. For when this was raised, it was not permitted to take anyone alive on pain of death. Accordingly, neither side took prisoners, and so the French death toll was enormous. A similar explanation was offered for a similar decision made at the Battle of Aljubarrota, 1385, by King John I of Portugal. Froissart reports an account of the battle given to John of Gaunt by a Portuguese envoy. And according to Froissart's retelling of this account, the King of Portugal commanded on pain of death by beheading that no one should hold anyone to ransom that day if we were victorious. Either all were to die or all live. This instruction was for the best, since, as the Lord said, if we were to occupy ourselves in taking prisoners, we would become distracted and not pay due attention to what we should be doing. It is better for us to concentrate on fighting well rather than succumb to an avaricious desire to take prisoners, and give it our all, as good men must do whose heritage is at stake. This pronouncement was accepted and adhered to. Consequently, again according to Froissart's record of the Portuguese envoy's report, quote, more than 4,000 true men-at-arms were killed in the field, none were held to ransom. However, a different account of the battle is also offered by Froissart earlier in his work, and this suggests that this decision was taken only once the battle had already started, and that men who had already been taken prisoner were deliberately killed in cold blood. According to this account, an initial attack by the French contingent had been defeated, and many of the French captured. Then the main Castilian force advanced, led by their king, and at this point, quote, it was ordered that on pain of death, on the spot, any man who had taken prisoners must kill them immediately, and that neither the noble, powerful, nor rich among them should be spared. And Froissart relates that over 300 prisoners were killed, adding that they would have fetched some 400,000 francs in ransoms. And interestingly, this account records a rather different explanation for the killings. The Portuguese and the English, who had given this advice, this according to Froissart again, said, if we do not slay them, they will escape whilst we are busy defending ourselves in combat, and then they will kill us. A man may never trust his enemy. It should, of course, be noted, as this quote suggests, that there were substantial English and French contingents present at the battle, albeit obviously on opposing sides. So, as indeed Froissart's two accounts indicate, the treatment of those who surrendered at the battle would have been well known outside of Portugal, whether presented as an order not to take prisoners or as a massacre of prisoners already taken. A similar justification was used for perhaps the most notorious battlefield killing of prisoners, that at Agincourt, which Sean McGlynn discussed on Saturday. The author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, who was with the English army, explained that just as the English thought the battle was over, a shout went up that the enemy's mounted rearguard, in incomparable number and still fresh, were re-establishing their position and line of battle in order to launch an attack on us, few and weary as we were. And immediately, regardless of distinction of person, the prisoners were killed, lest they should involve us in utter disaster in the fighting that would ensue. An even more deliberate and cold-blooded massacre of prisoners had taken place after the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 on the Anglo-Scottish border. The Scottish chronicler Andrew of Winton, writing in the early 15th century but drawing on earlier 14th century chronicle source, records that on the morning after the battle, Edward III ordered all of the prisoners to be slain, and this received some confirmation from the Chronicle of Mow Abbey, Yorkshire, compiled by Abbot Thomas Burton at the end of the 14th century. After describing how, quote, the English archers reaped the greatest slaughter of the battle, Burton adds that, again quote, on the day after, the king ordered 100 prisoners to be beheaded. And it's worth noting that according to the Bridlington Chronicle, another late 14th century Yorkshire chronicle, Archibald Douglas, who led the Scots at Halidon, had proclaimed in a pre-battle speech to his men that, quote, nor should any ransom be granted, but princes and footmen alike shall perish this day. although it does have to be said that the Bridlington chronicler was not above putting speeches in the mouths of his protagonists, so there may be a certain amount of invention there. And the same chronicler remarks of the battle that few Scots were taken prisoner, though he adds the detail that many escaped. Now, of course, it would hardly be wise to ground an argument solely on the testimony of chroniclers with such creative talents and imagination as Jean Froissart and Geoffrey the Baker. However, the explanations they offer are echoed in the writings of Geoffrey de Charny, a prominent French nobleman and author of the Livre de Chivalry, the Book of Chivalry, a discourse on the practice of chivalry. Charny knew whereof he wrote, for the work was derived from years of personal experience of warfare. His career would culminate in his death at Poitiers while bearing the Oriflamme banner. He was not at Crecy, but his book was probably written not long after the battle, perhaps while he was in captivity in England in 1351. And in discussing the faults to which men-at-arms might fall prone, he comments, "It can also happen that when there is action on the battlefield, there are a number of men who pay more attention to taking prisoners and other profit. And when they have seized them and other winnings, they are more anxious to safeguard their captives and their booty than to help bring the battle to a good conclusion. And it may well be that a battle can be lost in this way." The refusal to take prisoners on the battlefield, and even battlefield massacres of prisoners already taken, were not, therefore, altogether unusual. However, even where there was no such policy, surrender was not always accepted in the heat of battle. The Gesta Henrici Quinti includes an interesting passage describing attempts by Frenchmen to surrender at Agincourt. Indeed, fear and trembling seized them, for, so it was said among the army, the English army, there were some of them, even though they were more nobly born, who that day surrendered themselves more than 10 times. No one, however, had time to take them prisoner, but almost all, without distinction of person, were, as soon as they were struck down, put to death without respite, either by those who had laid them low, or by others following after. By what secret judgments of God is not known. Now, of course, there's a degree of self-contradiction here. Few Frenchmen could have managed to surrender more than once if almost all of them were put to death without respite, as soon as they tried. Nevertheless, this does suggest the great practical difficulties in attempting to surrender amidst the turmoil of a full-scale pitched battle. It's also interesting that he talks about people having been struck down and trying to surrender when they were already presumably lying on the ground. Now, of course, one of the problems in discussing surrender in battle is determining precise numbers. For the taking of a prisoner was a private agreement between captor and captive, and chroniclers, of course, are notorious for not providing reliable figures. However, increasingly, prisoners of war became subject to interference by the Crown. And this does provide us with some hard data concerning numbers of prisoners. Remy Amble, in particular, has made very effective use of evidence for prisoners taken at Agincourt in this manner. I will deal with the Battle of Neville's Cross, which we are particularly also well informed about, which was fought near Durham in 1346. The most prominent prisoner, of course, being David II, King of Scots. In a newsletter written very soon after the event, the Yorkshire clerk Tom Sampson gave a list of the killed and captured. Aside from King David, the captives included 27 named individuals, quote, and other persons, knights and esquires, to a great number, names of which men are not yet known for certain. But on the 20th of November, a month after the battle, it was proclaimed, in a writ from the Crown, that because in times before very great damages of various kinds have befallen us and our whole kingdom of England through the release of Scots, our enemies, captured in war, no prisoner taken at battle was to be ransomed or released under pain of forfeiture of life and limb, but all were to be handed over to the custody of the king. And following this proclamation, writs name some 54 Scottish prisoners, excluding King David, who were ordered to be taken into Crown custody. Now, of course, there was a degree of evasion. Sir Robert Bertram, Sheriff of Northumberland, captured Malcolm Fleming, Earl of Wigton, and John Douglas at the battle. He appears to have handed Douglas over to the Crown promptly, but he kept Fleming at his castle in Northumberland of Bothwell, claiming that the Earl was ill. The Earl subsequently escaped in what was probably an illicit private ransom deal. However, the Crown was well aware of Fleming's capture, and Bertram was threatened with imprisonment in the Tower, although he was subsequently let off. The Lancashire squire John Standish apparently handed over his prisoner David Murray, named in one of the writs, to the Crown as requested. But it appears that he managed to conceal another prisoner, Sir William Liddell, who isn't named in any of the Crown records, for a subsequent petition from Liddell himself reveals that he was put to ransom by Standish, and this appears to have been without the Crown's knowledge. Nevertheless, the Crown did take vigorous measures to try to ensure that all the prisoners taken at the battle were identified, and issued several high-powered commissions of inquiry to ensure that this was the case. And certainly, all but 6 of those listed as captured by Sampson are also named as prisoners in Crown records. Although, of course, whether these were actually all handed over to the Crown in custody or not is another matter. And several of those listed by Sampson as amongst the dead were also actually listed as prisoners in Crown records. It also appears that many of these prisoners were of comparatively low status. The 3 joint captors of Sir Andrew Campbell, for instance, received just 50 marks between them for their pains from the King. And this price does presumably reflect a fair reflection of his ransom value, as other captors were granted considerably higher rewards for higher ranking prisoners. So it's not, therefore, just the major prisoners with whom the Crown was concerned, but does appear to be all of them. Consequently, it is likely that the 54 Scottish prisoners listed in Crown records does actually represent the majority, and probably large majority, of all those who were captured in the battle. Of course, the number of Scottish dead is more difficult to gauge. Sampson listed 28 named individuals as killed, though some of these were actually captured, but put the total number of knights and men-at-arms killed at, quote, around 540, excluding those killed in the pursuit. Writing as he was in the immediate aftermath of the battle, his report does not appear to be subject to the customary chronicler's hyperbole, and may have been based on account of the bodies. Though interestingly, his figures accord well with numbers given in Scottish chronicles. Now, if these figures are at all reliable, it therefore appears that the number of Scottish men-at-arms taken prisoner was just a small fraction of the number who were killed. Now, the English army at Neville's Cross was made up entirely of northerners fighting defensively, and therefore the difficulties of transporting prisoners to a secure base would have been at a minimum. Furthermore, as most of them lived no more than 3 or 4 days' ride from the Scottish border, ransoming of prisoners and obtaining payment would have been much easier than for Englishmen fighting on an expedition in France. In other words, Neville's Cross might be considered a battle where the conditions for ransoming prisoners were, comparatively speaking, ideal, particularly as there is nothing to suggest that the Crown's policy of taking prisoners into its own custody was announced in advance. Nevertheless, very few Scots were allowed to surrender, and many were killed during the pursuit when prisoners could have been taken without distraction from the immediate task of winning the battle. And this may perhaps suggest, I'm rather flying a kite here, that the English actually preferred to kill Scottish men-at-arms than capture them, except for the highest ranking of the nobility. And of course, all of this excludes the non-armigerous Scots, for whom no reliable casualty figures are available. Now, the law of arms did not permit the killing of those who tried to surrender under... the law of arms did permit the killing of those who tried to surrender under certain circumstances. The unfurling of the Oriflamme banner at Cressy was a recognised signal that a legal state of mortal war was in force. Under such a state of war, it was legitimate to take no prisoners, though it was unusual to declare a state of mortal war within Christendom against fellow Christians. But there is no evidence that Edward III signalled a state of mortal war before Halidon Hill, and there was no state of mortal war at Agincourt or Aljubarrota, otherwise there would have been no prisoners to be killed. It is thus significant that while contemporaries might have regretted the killing of prisoners on the battlefield, they did not denounce such acts as contrary to the laws of war. Thus, describing Edward III's killing of prisoners after Halidon Hill, Andrew Winton, Scottish chronicler, comments that it was, quote, a great pity to behold those that might not help themselves in no manner, so to be slain without sparing. However, he makes no suggestion that Edward's actions were actually illegal. Nor does English chronicler Thomas Burton consider it necessary to defend or even to comment on the killings. Froissart commented that the killing of prisoners at Aljubarrota, quote, was truly a great shame. And his comment that whoever is in prison is not dead, which he started with, coming as it does just before his description of the killing of the prisoners, could be read as an implicit criticism. Nevertheless, if criticism it be, it remains implicit and not explicit. And this contrasts with Froissart's forthright condemnation of the massacre ordered by the Black Prince at the siege of Limoges in 1370, even though at Limoges the Black Prince was acting entirely within the recognised constraints of the bounds of law. For under the customs of war, the inhabitants of any town taken by storm could legitimately be slaughtered as a condign punishment for their rebellion in refusing to surrender. Similarly, French accounts of the Battle of Agincourt, where they mention the killing of prisoners, generally explain it in terms of military necessity. The same explanation offered by English accounts. Henry is said to have ordered the killing because of the threat of a new attack by the French, although the precise nature of the threat varies from account to account. The Burgundian chroniclers Jean Lefebvre and Jean de Warren comment that it was a pitiable manner. But they put the blame on, quote, a wretched company of the French who had caused the death of these noble knights. Now, this may well have been an exercise in scapegoating influenced by the agendas of French and Burgundian politics, but it is nevertheless surely significant that no French source explicitly criticises Henry for his actions. And these include Jean Juvenal d'Ersin, a staunch supporter of the French kings, who explains the killings thus. The French rallied, which was a bad thing, for most of the English killed their prisoners, and that's all he has to say. Now, there was some degree of reluctance to accept the killing of prisoners. According to Winton, after Halidon Hill, many of the English disobeyed Edward III's orders. Quote, good men, for pity, saved their prisoners then, and so many worthy knights were saved. Although this may just have been intended to portray Edward as pitiless, by contrast with his own men. More cynically, Jean Lefebvre and Jean de Warren record that when Henry V ordered the killing of prisoners, those who had taken them did not want to kill them, for they were all hoping to collect a large ransom from their prisoners. And at Poitiers, the Anglo-Gascon victors took numerous prisoners, despite the fact that King John of France had raised the oriflamme and had, according to Henry Knighton's account, issued an order that the life of no Englishman was to be spared except that of the Prince of Wales himself. However, the attitude most contemporaries had to the killing of prisoners on the battlefield seems to have been summed up by a comment ascribed by the French Chronicle of Saint-Omer to Edward III during the Battle of Crécy. Some knights from the Empire who were serving in his company complained of the slaughter, saying to him, we greatly wonder that you should allow that so much noble blood should be expended, for if you took ransom, you would achieve a great part of your war and huge ransoms would ensue. And the king replied, they should not wonder, because it had been ordered so, and so it had to be. Now, even in battles where the winning side did not have a deliberate policy of taking no prisoners, the exigencies of the battlefield often meant that only a small proportion of the defeated were able to surrender themselves safely. Consequently, a majority of those on the losing side who did not manage to run away fast enough were likely to get killed, including even the highest ranks of the nobility. And the chivalric ethos, which so thoroughly imbued the martial classes of Western Christendom, equated running away with dishonour. Those who were defeated in battle therefore faced the likely but unpalatable prospects of either dishonour or death. And it may perhaps be that the daunting knowledge of the probably terrible personal consequences of defeat was one of the factors which encouraged the avoidance of battle, which was such a feature of the era of the 100 Years' War. But it has to be remembered the laws of war were customary law, open to reinterpretation based on practice. And while the process of ransoming prisoners, once they had been safely removed from the battlefield, was increasingly influenced by the procedures of contract law, the laws pertaining on the battlefield remained subject to the dictates of harsh military necessity. Throughout this period, a full-scale pitched battle remained an exceptional event. And in practice, during such battles, exceptions to the usual rules governing the surrender and treatment of prisoners seemed to have been generally accepted as an unfortunate necessity. In this context, the killing of prisoners in the battlefield was not considered to be unchivalric. Chivalry was, above all else, a martial ethic, and winning was what mattered. Or as Geoffrey de Charny put it, in a refrain repeated throughout his work, "He who does best is most worthy." If the killing of prisoners was necessary in order to ensure victory in battle, then it was, in fact, an act of chivalry. Thank you.